So I'm Jim Thomas from the Etc. Group, and we've been here in Sharm el-Sheikh at the meeting of the Convention on Biological Diversity for the last week. And the topic we've been following, this issue of gene drives and synthetic biology, has become one of the hottest topics. It's really caused division and controversy, kind of as to be expected. But there have been negotiations going on and things are beginning to move a little bit now.
So can you give just a bit of a debrief over what are some of the things that happened over this week at the COP?
Sure. Well, the week started and there had been calls for a moratorium on gene drives that had come from 250 different organizations, from the movements of peasants like La Via Campesina, and others, a very strong call for that. And of course, the gene drive developers, projects like Target Malaria, the Island Conservation and the Gates Foundation are also here in force trying to stop a moratorium. And at the beginning we had the positions of the countries were laid out, and there were a number of countries such as Bolivia, El Salvador, Grenada, and Egypt and others who said they wanted a moratorium. But perhaps most shocking were to see a number of African countries, in fact one after another African country, speak out against a moratorium. And this is a major shift for Africa, and it became very clear that the African group had been really taken over by a small group of biotech lobbyists, and seemingly African countries have been, because this is a technology driven by Bill Gates and who's a very large funder on the continent, the African group had shifted against the moratorium, and that really set the stage for quite a clash here in Sharm el-Sheikh.
And so how did African civil society and activists who have been here at the COP all these days, how have they been responding to what's happening within the Africa group?
Well, so not just African civil society, but I think civil society broadly, as well as indigenous peoples, youth, women, were extremely concerned by this turnaround by Africa. African groups mobilized, they produced a statement, so it was signed by I think 36 or more African farmers groups, environmental groups and so forth, calling on African negotiators not to betray Africa. That this really is such a different position from how African movements had been calling for gene drive moratorium. And indeed, a number of African countries privately are telling us they're not happy with this. There have even been African countries that have spoken out against the African group. It's been a massive point of contention all week. And so that really has been the background to the negotiations. The negotiations have gone through a series of closed meetings, what are called contact groups. And in the contact groups, there's now been language coming forward about gene drives and about how to deal with gene drives.
And so in this, there was a contact group tonight. Is there anything you can report back over, which was on synthetic biology? Is there anything you can report back about where we're at now in terms of the synthetic biology paper?
Sure. Well, I mean, the countries, the precautionary countries, the ones that were really wanting something like a moratorium, had wanted some language that would say countries should avoid any release of gene drives until a number of conditions have been met. In fact, we have the beginning of language that goes in that direction, that only if certain kinds of conditions are met will it be possible to release gene drives. So it's not as strong as a global moratorium, but it's exceedingly precautionary and really says you have to meet these conditions. The first of those conditions is about risk assessment and risk management, scientifically based, and that's now been agreed. In fact, pretty much everybody has now agreed that unless those risk assessment, risk management procedures have been followed, you shouldn't have release of gene drives, even for experimental purposes. That's a good step forward. It's the first step of precaution. Now the discussion is about the rights of indigenous people. That if you're releasing, and local communities, that if you're releasing gene drives onto lands and territories of indigenous people, you need their free, prior, and informed consent. And here there's a fight. Countries that traditionally have stood up for their indigenous peoples are saying very clearly, this is a condition we have to have. We can't be releasing this if it affects indigenous people. But we're seeing countries, including countries that have signed up for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, throw indigenous people under the bus. So this is now the fight. can we agree here at the UN that Indigenous people and their free, prior, informed consent has to be sought before releasing these spreading risky gene drives?
So now we're about halfway through the COP. There's still another week to go. Is there anything we can expect? Is there anything you can foresee, or what do you foresee for the next week?
Well, it's about to be the weekend here in Sharm el Sheikh. The weekend starts on Friday, and parties will be consulting with their capitals. They'll be hopefully talking to their Indigenous people. I think when their Indigenous people find out about some of the positions they're taking, hopefully they'll listen to their Indigenous peoples and local communities. And next week we'll probably see a continuation of this fight about whether the consent of Indigenous people and local communities who will be affected has to be sought before you go releasing gene drives, spreading genetic organisms onto their lands and territories, affecting their rights. It's, from the point of view of justice, it's straightforward. It's absolutely wrong to be releasing gene drives into the local communities without getting their consent beforehand. But here there are powerful lobbies who are trying to stop that.